Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about inclusive education and why inclusive education is important in our school and, of course, in our society. Okay, so listen very carefully because I would like you to um, gain the following, which is for you to define what inclusive education, or they call it as IE, is, and understand its importance in education and, of course, in our community. Okay, so let's start. If you look at this picture, what do you see? What kind of learners do we have inside the classroom? How do you describe them? How do they interact? Does it look like an inclusive classroom for you? According to UNICEF, every child has the right to quality education and learning. So, this picture for sure represents, I hope, an inclusive kind of classroom. So, let's define what inclusive education is based on research. Now, Jukes and Lamar Jukes, okay, define inclusive education as all students being educated where they should be educated if they did not have a disability. You understand what that means? So, when it comes to their age appropriate general education classes in their neighborhood school. So, of course, an inclusive classroom with necessary supports provided to students, educators, and families so that all in the community or in the education system can be very much successful. So, that is a definition of IE by Jukes and Lamar. Now, another or more definitions of inclusive education, as you can see, is actually based on research and based on the meaning from UNICEF. So, their meaning of IE is that it is an education system that includes all students. They mean all, and welcomes and supports them to learn, whoever they are and whatever their abilities or requirements are. Secondly, it also means all children learning together in the same school. So, what does that mean? This means that they try to make sure that teaching in the curriculum, school buildings, classrooms, and even play areas, transport, and toilets are, of course, appropriate for all children at all levels. And thirdly, so the third definition, it says there no one should be excluded. Every child has a right to inclusive education, even those who have disabilities. So those are some of the definitions of inclusive education. And more definitions from during the Salamanca Conference in 1994. For them, they define inclusive education as the following: schools should accommodate all children, regardless of their physical, intellectual, social, linguistic, or even other conditions. And when they say all of this one, it includes, of course, the disabled and gifted children, even those who are on the street, and working children from remote or even nomadic population. It means children who keeps on changing their address or their place, or they always go from one place to another. They're also included. Thirdly, it also includes children from linguistic, ethnic, or cultural minorities. And lastly, children from other disadvantaged or marginalized groups. So it's very clear these definitions and who should be included in an inclusive classroom. And as you can see, And if you notice, inclusive education or IE is loaded with many positive terms. So we can see here, whenever we hear inclusive education, there are actually many words, many synonyms that comes out into our minds, such as full participation, involvement, support, tolerance, security, friendship, teamwork, individualized instructional approach in group environment. Even the terms such as problem solving comes out. The term integration, acceptance, recognition, localization, resource mobilization, humane, access to all, success for all, and barrier free. Wow, these are actually all positive terms which are included and are connected and related to inclusive education. And if you notice, all of this must operate in a harmonious environment in the regular classroom setting. Thus, inclusive education presupposes a unique culture of inclusion, right? Okay, so let's continue. This is also an image that I got from UNICEF. According to them, they actually made it clear on why inclusive education is important. So you can see here the different cases. So from the educational case, they emphasize that inclusive education is important because all children learn more effectively. This is actually research backed up. Based on research, if children are all included in one class, regardless of their diversity, okay, they actually learn more in the classroom. And based on some researches too, it improves learning for all children, both those with and without disabilities. So that is for the educational case. Now, moving on, how about when it comes to the social case? So there are actually some reasons on why it is important. Because in the social case, it contributes to more inclusive societies. Wow. Inclusive education promotes understanding, reduces prejudice, and thus strengthens social integration. So you can see from the educational case to the social case, another important reason on why inclusive education should be learned and studied and be used is for its economic case. Why? Because it is cost effective. It ensures that children with disabilities are equipped to work and contribute economically and socially to their communities. We actually have observed this one many times, having some colleagues with disabilities, but they actually contribute very well in our workforce. So I actually experienced this one firsthand. Even they are actually the leader sometimes in our team, and they actually perform well more than my other regular colleagues in the past. Okay, so I will just emphasize, just so that you can see this, three important reasons on about inclusive education. The first one is its importance when it comes to educational case, social case, and of course the economic case. Now, aside from this importance which were given by UNICEF, there are also many reasons on why IE is important based on many researches. So we can see here, the first reason is that all children are able to be part of the community and develop a sense of belonging and become better prepared for life in the community as children and adults. So they also believe that if children learn in an inclusive education classroom, it would provide better opportunities for learning. So children actually with varying abilities are sometimes often better motivated when they learn in classes surrounded by other children. That is again based on some researches and observations of more or many educators. Another reason, the expectations of the children are usually higher. Successful inclusion usually attempts to develop on individual strengths and gifts. And fourth reason is that it allows children to work on individual goals while being with other students their own age. So, aside from these reasons on why inclusive education is important, more reasons is that according to some researchers, it also encourages the involvement of parents in the education of their children and the activities of their local school because it actually lets the teacher or educators usually get permission and even ask their parents about some activities, okay, that they can probably or possibly use for their children too, or even they let the parents contribute to the education of their children. Sixth reason is that it fosters a culture of respect and belonging. Why or how? Because it also provides the opportunity to learn about and accept individual differences of the learner. So if they see that, if the children see that all of them are different in the classroom, it's kind of like becoming like something which is normal for them. Thus, accepting that that kind of surrounding or community is actually just normal, right? Next, another reason is it provides all children with opportunities to develop friendships with one another. Yes, I actually observed this one firsthand, regardless of their disability, regardless of their diversity, okay, regardless of their race, ethnicity, and their cultural background, the friendships that they have actually stays longer from childhood until they become adults. And aside from that, friendships provide role models, of course, and more opportunities for their growth. So these are just some of the reasons on why inclusive education is a very, very important approach in our education. Now, UNICEF showed also this image which discusses about the reason on how inclusive education is connected to children with disabilities realizing their rights. Why? Because, as you know, all human rights are actually interlinked. This, of course, includes the rights of the children to education. It is actually impossible to achieve an effective education unless other rights are, of course, realized. And if the right to education is fulfilled, it leads to the realization of other rights. So let's see the interconnection or interlinked connection of these two. So the requirements of inclusive education requires non-discrimination, best interest of the children, right of the child to be heard, protection from violence and abuse. What else? Opportunity for life within the community, support with mobility, access to health care, and habilitation and rehabilitation. So these actually kinds of requirements of inclusive education could also promote the rights of the children when it comes to their participation in public life or in the society. Secondly, it also promotes the children's exercise of legal capacity. Thirdly, it also promotes the right for work and employment. And lastly, it also promotes adequate standard of living. So these two are actually very much interconnected. Therefore, the government should think about inclusive education, which is alongside other children's rights. I'll repeat, If the right to education is fulfilled, it leads to the realization of other rights of the children. So that is how inclusive education is connected to children with disabilities, realizing, of course, their rights. Now, UNICEF also discussed some of the requirements to make inclusive education happen. How could we possibly do this one? So, we could actually do this. We could actually do this one if we can end discrimination. So, firstly, I'll repeat requirements to make inclusive education happen. Okay, as an end to discrimination. Okay, we can also make inclusive education happen. Okay, secondly, as an end to excluding children with disabilities. Okay, another one. Thirdly, requirements to make inclusive education happen. Thirdly, is access to primary and secondary education with enough accessible and inclusive schools, including children with disabilities caught in crisis and even emergencies. They also talked about the practical support or adaptations to students to enable them to learn reasonable accommodation. Wow. So, aside from that one, more requirements of inclusive education is individual education plans for children with disabilities, setting out what accommodations and support they need. Another is services for specific impairments such as learning braille, okay, the ones that the visually impaired usually use, or sign language even, okay. If somebody can teach them the basic ASL or basic sign language that they can use to communicate, that one is for the hearing impaired. And services for classroom reorganization even, and accessible learning materials. So these are just some of the requirements, but of course these cannot happen if the teachers who are involved are not adequately trained. Therefore, teachers should be trained to work in inclusive schools. Okay, so UNICEF gave these requirements to make inclusive education happen. Now, when it comes to inclusive education, sometimes some teachers interchange or make the terms integration and inclusion synonymous in their classes or when it comes to discussing something. But what actually are their difference? Are you familiar with their difference? Do you know that they are actually totally different from each other? Okay, in order for you not to be confused with the meaning of these two, let's see the aims of integration and inclusion. First, integration. The aim of integrated education is assimilation of children with diverse abilities into the existing classes and structures within a school. Okay, and as you can see, it emerged as a philosophical antithesis to segregation, and it helps a child fit into a pre existing model of schooling. Okay, so just to emphasize, it helps a child to fit into a pre existing model of schooling. However, when we say inclusion, inclusive actually totally differs from integration because it already assumes that all children are already a part of the regular school system from the very beginning. Okay, so inclusion demands a high level of teaching competency and organizational changes, which aims at promoting effective learning that is very important for school. Now, while both of these approaches actually have similarity, did you notice their similarity? What do you think is it? Their similarity actually, okay, is to bring students with disabilities into the mainstream classroom. So the regular classroom, I mean. Integration, on the other hand, expects students to adapt into the pre-existing structure, whereas when it comes to inclusion, it ensures the existing education system to adapt to each of the students. So both of them are actually totally different. I'll repeat the other one, which is integration, as you can see, expect students to adopt to the pre-existing structure, whereas inclusion ensures the existing education system will adapt to each of the students. So that is how different these two are. So I hope if you read or if you use these two terms, you will be careful in using them because their meaning is actually totally different from each other. Okay, so just to be clear, now the following, I'm going to talk about the principles of inclusive education. Actually, there are only three principles of inclusive education, but in some researches, they added more principles. But this one are just the top three principles of inclusive education that I got from the research. The first principle is all children belong. For them, inclusive education is based on the simple idea that every child and family is valued equally. Thus, they all deserve the same opportunity and experiences. Why? Because inclusive education is about children with disabilities, whether the disability is mild or severe, hidden or obvious, participating in everyday activities, just like they would if their disability were not present. It's also about friendship, membership, and having opportunities just like everyone else. So, the more diverse they encounter inside the classroom, of course, the more friendship they can have in the classroom. And actually, based on my observation in some of the schools where I've been, um, actually, I cannot even see the difference of a regular school, a special school. For me, that school actually showed me what really an inclusive classroom or inclusive school is. For them, everybody belongs and everybody is treated normally in the classroom. It was actually a great experience for me and my former students. Second principle of inclusive education is that all children learn different ways. Inclusion is about providing to help children. Children need to learn and participate in meaningful ways. Sometimes help from friends or teachers actually works best rather than doing something on their own, researching on their own. Other times, especially designed materials or technology can also help. But the point there is that the key is to give only as much help as needed. Okay. And the third principle of inclusive education, it is every child's right to be included. Now, inclusive education is a child's right and, of course, not a privilege. So, what does that mean? All of the children should go and undergo basic education. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act clearly states that all children with disabilities should be educated with non disabled children their own age and should have access to the general education curriculum. So, actually, it also goes back to the first principle, which is all children belong. So, these are just the three principles of inclusive education. The first principle is all children belong. Second one, all children learn different ways. And the third principle of inclusive education is It is every child's right to be included. Now, what I would like you to remember is that if inclusive education is not only the alternative measure for children with special needs or disability for want of separate special schools for these children, but inclusive education is a scientific, well thought strategy for the overall development of the learners. Now, in the next part of our lecture, I'm going to talk more about inclusive education, and I would like you to learn more about it so that in the future, if you're going to become a future educator, you can apply this approach in your classroom. Since actually these days we are having an inclusive classroom is very much necessary.